The next art medium that we're going to discuss is photography. Photography involves capturing an image and keeping it permanently on a surface. The camera has been around since ancient times, but it was not until the 19th century that a way was found to capture a projected image and keep it permanently. It has been known since ancient times that when light passes through a very tiny hole into a completely dark room or box, an image of whatever is on the outside of that little hole will project onto the back wall of that dark room or box, and it will be inverted. It'll be projected upside down. The name of a small room or box with a hole in it for this purpose is called a camera obscura. And this is basically like a very, very tiny hole. It's the basis for all photography. And as I mentioned, it's been around since ancient times. The way that it was used in the Renaissance is that artists would build this small room, which is called a camera obscura, which is, of course, where we get the word for camera, meaning room, and obscura meaning dark. And the camera obscura was used by Renaissance artists who were trying to capture a very realistic view of the world. When we get to talking about the Renaissance in a couple of weeks, this is a theme that we'll revisit again and again, is just how important it is for them to depict the world in as realistic means as possible. So artists would project an image of the whatever it was they wanted to make a painting of, and go into the room and trace it. And then this would then be transferred to their painting, and it could help them achieve all the realistic effects that they were looking for. So the camera has really been around for a very long time. What was not around was a way to fix that image and keep it. So today's camera, if you're looking at just like your typical, 20th century camera or modern day DSLR, it's a variation on the camera obscura. It's still a dark box with a small hole that light passes through. Nowadays, we do have a lens which helps bring that image into focus, and it passes through and registers on what in traditional cameras would be a piece of film, but in today's modern cameras is usually a computer sensor. Here's the first photograph. The photographer's name was Joseph Niepce. The year is 1826, and he invented a technique where he took a piece of pewter, which is a type of metal. It was specially coated with chemicals that were light sensitive, and placed in a camera obscura. The plate was exposed for 8 hours, which is a really, really long time. And the chemicals on the plate reacted with the light and gave us this picture. It was the view out of his window. Here is a picture of the very first person to ever be photographed, or I should say the first two people. Louis Daguerre was someone who worked very closely with Joseph Niepce. They were both working kind of together and independently, trying to find chemical ways to fix photographic images. Daguerre was able to get much sharper, clearer pictures that didn't take quite as long to expose. And so you can see similarly a chemical coated plate was placed inside a camera obscura and directed out of his window. This was a bright, busy day. You can see he's looking onto a city street. I do want you to notice just the sharpness and the clarity of this picture, which dates to 1830s. I don't have the exact date on there. There would have been people all about in the street, horses and buggies and people moving up and down the street. But because the exposure was 10 to 20 minutes long, nobody was standing still long enough to have their image, their likeness captured, except for this guy right here. This guy right here. This is a man getting his shoe shined. And so you can kind of see him there. And he actually stood still long enough that he was able to be captured in this 10 to 20 minute exposure. So the daguerreotype rapidly became a very popular new thing in the 19th century. This was the first time really that just regular people of modest means could afford to have their portrait done. Going back to ancient times, portraits were only for the wealthy. You had to hire an artist to paint your likeness or paint or sculpt your likeness, and this was not somebody that just anybody could afford. But daguerreotype studios just started popping up all over the place, and people, for a very little amount of money, could go in and pose and have their portrait done. Now, a daguerreotype, you couldn't have multiples of an image. It was on a piece of metal. So there was only one. It was just kind of a one-of-a-kind, non-reproducible image. And so the next thing that photographers are trying to figure out how to do is how can we make multiples of an image? And one of the first examples was the calotype, where a translucent paper negative was developed, which then the negative would be placed on a piece of light-sensitive paper and exposed to light, resulting in a positive image. So this made it possible to have multiples of a single image. But the drawback was that it didn't have the sharpness and the clarity that the daguerreotype had. So eventually a process was developed called the collodion wet plate process, where the negative was actually a piece of glass. It had to be kept wet, but it made for a very sharp image. But the drawback was that it had to be developed right away. So what would happen is you would have these photographers going around the country to take pictures, and they had their own little portable darkroom with them. So you would actually see photographers go around in horse-drawn wagons with all the chemicals and water and everything that they needed just right there in the back. Okay, so towards the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century, the gelatin silver process was invented, and this is when Kodak comes on the scene. They created a process where you could work on dry plates, and you could expose your negative on a piece of glass, and it could stay dry. And then you could just ship it off to them, and they'd develop it for you. So they started selling little chemical treated glass plates that people could place inside these little box cameras. This is, basically a camera obscura. That's all it is. They would place the glass negative in there, take the picture, and send it off to the company. And this is when we first start to see photography become something that's available to just average everyday people. You push the button and redo the rest was their was their tagline. So basically, the gelatin silver process is the type of process that you would see throughout pretty much all of the 20th century. And it wasn't really until after World War II that color photography became much of a thing. It had been around in various forms since the early 20th century, but it was very, very expensive, and the colors didn't look very good. And finally, in the 20th century, mid 20th century, that's when you kind of start to see color photography replacing black and white photography as the primary means of photographic expression. And moving right along through our technical history, we finally get to digital photography, which is what most of us are familiar with today. Of course, we all have cameras now in our phones, and some of you are probably old enough to remember the little portable digital cameras that everybody was carrying around in, the first years of the 21st century. But what I think a lot of people didn't know is that the first digital camera was actually invented in 1975. And so here's the camera with a lot of cassette tapes, which, if it's my understanding, they were treated with some sort of magnetic material. And back in those days, computers didn't come with monitors. You had to hook your computer up to a television set. And so this is the first digital photograph, presumably a picture of Steve Sesson's child, I'm assuming. So that's a very brief history of photography.